Well, it should be obvious to everyone that I'm going to do things a bit differently this morning. We have a slide behind us, or a PowerPoint, that we're going to try to use. And I had my granddaughter a few weeks ago, my youngest granddaughter, Kerrigan, to put this all together, and then I gave it to Burke. And Burke decided it wouldn't show up on the screen, so he did a lot of work this week to make it show up a little differently. And I wish that the building were packed. I wish that everyone in Cordell could hear what we're going to try to explain this morning, because we're going to look at a principle that is so very, very important to our lives. And I'm confident that it can make a difference for every one of us this morning. This principle was derived probably 25 years ago as I looked in the life of Elijah and then looked in the life of David. And I've been able to teach this to grocery store chains like Albertsons, or oil companies, or hospital groups, or educational groups, or churches, or individuals. It kind of goes on and on. So I want to try to share it with you this morning as we consider the question, what happened to David? Now, it's not a typical sermon as you might think, okay? So everybody bear with me, and I'll watch the time, because it normally takes me an hour and a half to 3 hours to get through this material. And yeah, Jack, I'll watch the time, and we'll try to do it. Jack's already bowing his head, getting sleepy, okay? But we'll break it up in little segments, so we won't get it done this week. And so you'll have to make sure you pay attention to what happens next week, because it's maybe more critical to us as we look at this material. What happened to David? Everyone remember from last week? We have said so many times, and it's exactly right, that David is a man of character. And David is a man of honor. And David is a man of unusual faith. What kind of young man will walk out and fight Goliath saying, God will deliver? And he is the one who is specifically chosen by God to be king, because God says, I found a heart after my own heart, or according to my own heart. David is an extra special person, and we'll see it over and over again. And yet last week we were looking at 1 Samuel chapter 21, and we saw this story unfolding that we could hardly believe. Do you remember the story? David has finally concluded that there's no way he can stay in the presence of King Saul. King Saul has a deranged mind, deranged because of jealousy and selfishness. And he is bound now to kill David. And David finally gets the last news from Jonathan, you've got to run for your life. He ends up at the town of Nob, little village, hopefully, a little town of Nob. And he's wanting some food and wanting some weapons, and it goes on and on. And you remember what David did to the priest named Elimelech? He lied. Over and over and over again, he lied. Then he went to Gath and he pretended to be a madman. The consequence of that, consequence was horrible. Because Saul, in his fury, killed Ahimelech, killed all of Ahimelech's sons except for one who escaped, killed all the women, all the children, all the babies, all the animals. Everything in Nob was destroyed, and it's all David's fault. And we ask this question. Have you ever seen someone who has consistent character, consistent integrity, consistent faith, and suddenly they do something that's so out of character? And David has just done something that's so out of character. Now, at the end of the story last week, we carefully noted how when David heard all that had happened, he would say, it's my fault. I will take responsibility. I do take responsibility. But I'm curious as to what happened. What would cause David to do what David did? Because I have seen so many really, really good people. People of character, people of integrity, people of faith. And all of a sudden they do something that's so out of character. And you can hardly believe that you're hearing this story, that they did this. Well, I want to try to show you from David's life, from this story that we've been rehearsing, and also from the life of Elijah, how this all takes place, even in our own lives. So Burke has redone the slides, and Burke, we don't have a little clicker, so Burke's doing it back there trying to keep up with me. So I want to show you the first part of the principle. And again, I know it doesn't seem like I'm teaching the Bible, but I promise you before I end, in a couple of weeks or 3 weeks, you will see it come alive in Scripture. If you have pencil and paper, or maybe you can just memorize it, it's fatigue that leads to fog, a mental fog, that would in turn would lead us to flirt with things with which we would normally never flirt. Now, I know without asking, you have been in a mental fog many times in your life. You can't find clarity. You can't find the direction. You can't find the answer to the problem. It's much like being in a literal fog trying to drive. And everyone in this audience has driven in a very, very dense fog. And you can't see in front of you very far, and you don't know if there's a car in front. You don't know how fast to drive. You're afraid to stop because you're afraid somebody will run into the back of you. You're afraid to get off the road because you don't know what's off the side of the road. You don't know how far to get off. And so you just creep. You creep along trying to make your way through that fog. And that's what happens to us in this life. Sometimes we find ourselves in a situation where we're in a mental fog. We can't see which direction to go. We can't see the answer to the problem. And so there again, case in point, try harder and harder when I get in that situation. I work harder and harder to try to make an answer come clear. And I can't go to sleep at night. Or I finally get to sleep and I wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and the problem's right back. And I go through the day and it consumes me because I cannot figure it out. And if that gets deep enough, the next slide will show you if that fog gets deep enough, we begin to be desperate. And we begin to flirt with things with which we would normally never flirt. And so someone might run off and leave their family. I've seen it happen. Close up. Or someone might decide to have an affair. Or someone might quit their job. Or someone might turn to some substance like alcohol. Or someone might take some money. They flirt with something that normally they would never, ever consider. Now, is any of that making any sense to you? Fatigue leads to a fog, and it causes us to flirt with things we would normally never flirt with. I will promise you, we'll show you that David is in exactly this cycle in 1 Samuel chapter 21. But the big issue is, how do we get fatigued? What happens to cause us to be fatigued? And I think there are 3 energy sources inside of every one of us. God has placed 3 things inside of us. 3 energy reservoirs, you might call it. We have a physical, an emotional, and a spiritual energy reservoir within us. And if any one of these or more begins to be drained, you and I are subject to this horrible fatigue that leads us to a fog, that leads us to flirt with things we'd normally never consider. Now, Everyone knows about the physical depletion of energy, don't you? Everyone knows about that. I think we have that up there. Physically, most people just overwork. You know, there are some people in our world today who work 60 hours a week and 70 hours a week, and it's 6 days a week and sometimes beyond that, and you just overwork. And you can probably draw your own diagram and put your own list up there, and sometimes it's stress that wears us down physically. And sometimes it's a poor diet. And sometimes it's not enough exercise. And sometimes it's an illness that wears us down physically. And sometimes it's just getting older. Those of us who are getting older, have you noticed you can't do what you used to do, and you get more tired more quickly? Everyone knows what it means to be physically depleted with your energy. I have taught this to so many audiences that don't even know it comes from the Bible. I ultimately tell every audience that. But almost every audience is confused by the spiritual tank. If you jump over to the spiritual tank, you have spiritual energy, but you can lose your spiritual energy. And somehow we have to define what it means to be spiritual. So many, many years ago, a person walked up to me, a person who had all these degrees in theology. I think it was a test. Tell me what it means to be spiritual. You keep using this word spiritual. Tell me what it means to be spiritual. I don't think I did really well with his test. But I will tell you what I've come to now. There is one giant word in spirituality. And that word is connection. That word is connection. Now, you may not like what I'm about to say. But you can go to church all of your life and you can be there 3 times a week and have no connection to God. And you can know facts and figures, and you can know books and chapters and verses, and it does not mean that you necessarily have a connection with God. A connection with God is cultivated when you understand about becoming His child and you understand that you really are a child of God. And why do you think for 4 years, almost 4 years, I've been talking over and over again about trust? Because the word trust embodies connection. It embodies a realization every move I make is connected with God. And I'm depending upon God. And I frequently pause and ask God to intervene in the little things and the big things. And connection comes over time. And it comes with awareness of God. And it comes with making God a part of your thinking more and more. And so many people are walking around and they may attend church, but they have no connection and they become so easily spiritually weak or drained. Does that make sense? But the big one, I shouldn't say the big one, the more common one and the less understood one is what happens to us emotionally. The emotional energy in our lives. Because there are so many things that drain us emotionally. And so I put some up there. Fear. Fear drains you emotionally. This country right now is fragile. This country is frustrated. But this country is afraid. This country has been made to be afraid. Right or wrong, it's been made to be afraid. Stress will do it. If you have financial problems, consistent financial problems, it will drain you emotionally. The big one on that slide is relationship problems. If you have a continual relationship problem with a spouse, continual, you know how that feels, don't you? Emotionally, you're drained. Or what if you have a child, and that child is in constant trouble, or that child is causing constant trouble in your life? Or what if you work for a tyrant who can never be pleased? Or what if you work along beside someone that's literally driving you crazy and you get emotionally drained? Now, I put one other up there, big events. Have you ever planned for weeks or maybe months for a big event, and you work toward it, and the day comes, and you go through that event, and the event is finished, and at the end of the day, how do you feel? Some of you know this story. One of the greatest things ever happened in our life was being invited to go to Lubbock Christian University to be the president. They only chose me because they could find no one else. That's literal. They could find no one else. And I was so green and so naive when I took the job. Our daughter announced at the very same time that she was going to get married. I took the job in May. She announced that she was going to have a December wedding. We called it a Christmas wedding. I'll give you a little advice. Most of you have already been through this, so you won't need the advice. But don't ever go for a long engagement with your child, because the longer the engagement, the more it costs you. Okay? She said she was going to get married on December the 11th. I didn't even think about looking at the school calendar. Until way into this thing, I looked at the school calendar. December 11th is fall graduation. And back in those days, we had a Friday night baccalaureate. I had to speak at the baccalaureate that year. So I ran off to the baccalaureate. I spoke. I ran over to the church building. We go through the rehearsal. If you've never been through a wedding rehearsal, it's been really perfect, have you? Someone's always upset. There's always a problem. And then we're going to go across town in Lubbock to the women's club to have a rehearsal dinner. Now, in the back of the car, in the back seat of the car, Jenny has bought for Kevin a wedding gift. It's a bridal portrait. Great big bridal portrait. It's in the back seat of the car. We're supposed to take it over to the house after the wedding and put it in the house, or actually before the wedding, so that they can come into the house, change their clothes before they go on their trip, and the first thing Kevin's going to see is this beautiful bridal portrait. It's in the back seat. My mother-in-law gets in the back seat, and I hear this crunching sound. Now, that's my mother-in-law, who refused to come today. I think she knew I was going to tell this story. So I have this friend from Dallas that's over, and he said, Ken, don't worry about it. I'll take it in the morning to Hobby Lobby. I'll stand there and make them fix it, and I'll take it to the house. Well, we get through all the rehearsal dinner. The next morning, I jump up and go out to the school. I got this funny-looking cap and gown on. I'm standing in front of all these people. I'm making funny statements. And I told them afterwards, don't ever make me say that kind of words again. I got to talk in plain English. And I finally get through shaking everybody's hands and all the pictures and all that, and I rush over to the church building. And it's time to get to the back of the auditorium. And I've got to walk Jenny down the aisle, and she's nervous and she's scared, and I'm popping jokes, and I'm doing everything I can to keep her spirits where there should be. And we go down and we finish this wedding, and my father-in-law is preaching the wedding, and then we go to the reception. And I'm really, really appreciative of all those people coming to the wedding and the reception. But I'm telling you, I'd look out and look down that line and think, this is never going to end. This is never going to end. Finally, it did. The last thing we're going to do, the very last thing we're going to do, we've got two doves that have been in a cage this whole wedding experience. Jeannie and Kevin are going to walk out and take the 2 doves, throw them up in the air. They're going to fly home. But those doves have been there a long time. And those doves are just as weary as I. So we go out on the edge of the church building, right there next to busy 34th Street. They throw their doves up in the air. Our doves don't fly. Our doves land in 34th Street. I'm out stopping traffic. Literally, I'm the one stopping traffic. I figure if a dove gets killed, it's going to cost me more money. I'm the last one to leave the church building because I'm sitting there with those doves waiting for the man to come and get the doves that won't fly. Finally, I get to go home. I turn the corner at our house. There are all these cars. Cars are everywhere. I get there and there are all these people at our house. They want to go out to eat. And I'm thinking, oh man, I'd just like to be by myself. We get through all that. Sunday morning, we go to church. Things are kind of back to normal a little bit. Jack and Elle are still there. Sunday night, they're still there. And our son rings our doorbell. Now, when your son, your child, rings your doorbell, you've got to have a clue something's not quite right. I opened the door. He's standing there with a little girl on his side. He said, Dad, you got to come and look at my car. I said, why do I need to come and look at your car? I've seen your car before. He said, not since I ran into the back of that pickup on Indiana Street. So I go out and look at the car and think, oh, how much is this going to cost me? The next morning I go to work. I think it's all over. About mid-morning I call Suze and say, are you okay? She said, well, you're not going to believe this, but Daddy was backing up his motorhome. He had our brick mailbox. Bricks are literally all over our front yard. Now, how do you think I felt at the end of all that? Where was I physically? I'd gone about as far as I could go. Where was I emotionally? I just felt numb. I couldn't process much of anything. Now, Burke, if you can, go back to the original big slide. Where do you think David is? Next one, Burke. Next one. Where do you think David is physically, emotionally, and it seems even spiritually? Now, you got to really think where David's been. David is the national hero. David has had success after success after success because God gave it to him. He's the giant killer. He's the military leader. He's now the son-in-law to the king. But Saul continues to chase him, threaten him. And now he's been hiding for 2 days while Jonathan one last time is trying to talk to his father Saul. He's waiting in eager anticipation. What's going to be the answer from Saul? Will he let me come back home? And Jonathan shoots the arrows. And the message comes, you have to go farther. The arrows are farther. And David now has that secret message. I've got to run. Can you imagine? Can you imagine this young man who's been such a leader and such an instrument of God? He's having to run for his life. He hadn't prepared for it. He didn't anticipate that being the answer, apparently. Because the reason he goes to Ahimelech is he needs help. He needs some food. Isn't that interesting? He needs food. Do you have any bread, Mr. Priest? I don't have any bread except that which is consecrated before God. And I need a weapon. Is there any weapon here? We have one sword. It's over there wrapped in some cloth behind the ephod. It's the sword of Goliath. Physically, he apparently is hungry. He's weary. He's worn out. But greater than that, where is he emotionally? What has happened to David emotionally? Had he ever thought it possible that he might have to run even past the borders of Israel to the land of Gath? Had he ever thought it possible that he would be the target of a deranged king? He was God's chosen one. He was the one whom Samuel poured the oil on his head. And guess what? He was afraid. He was afraid. When he got to Gath, and Achish the king saw him and recognized him and said, "Why, this is the one they've been singing about. He's killed his tens of thousands. Saul's killed his thousands, but he's killed his tens of thousands." And he would have known he's the Goliath killer because Goliath was from Gath. And it says David was so afraid that he pretended to be what? Do you remember? Insane. He clawed the doors. He let saliva run from his mouth into his face and into his beard, pretending he was insane so Achish would let him go. He's afraid. Did he have relationship problems? He had a massive relationship problem with Saul. Did he know where he was going to go? No. Did he know what he was going to do? No. Was he all by himself? Yes. Do you see how emotionally he is totally drained as you begin 1 Samuel chapter 21? Now it seems impossible, but for a moment, where is he spiritually? For a moment, where is he spiritually? And this is hard for me to actually articulate. Do you know that people of sound, strong commitment, trust, faith, can get so depleted physically and emotionally and are so down and so weary that they can even begin to forget that God is with them and that they are a child of God and that God is their greatest strength and God is their refuge and God is their ever-present help? They can forget that. I'm not sure I haven't been there this week. I'm not sure this week I didn't get so discouraged with some things and all the issues going on that I began to weaken in my confidence and my trust. That's why, where is this nation emotionally right now? And how many people are struggling physically because of all the other things that have happened? I talked to a medical doctor a month ago. He said, "Ken, my daughter is about to do her residency in internal medicine. But she decided to take a year before she entered that residency program, and she's just going to be a hospitalist in Boston, one of the hospitals." He said, she called me. And she said, "Dad, I've never seen anything like this in my life." She said, "One of the medical doctors with whom I work committed suicide. We are overworked. We don't know the answers. We are so stressed." Committed suicide? Can you get so physically and emotionally and spiritually exhausted that you would take that pathway? If you don't believe that, wait till we talk about Elijah next week and watch him asking God, begging God to let him die. And so David does something that is totally out of character. Does something that's totally out of character. I'm begging you, do not make harsh, and snap judgments about other people. when they do something so very wrong and so very different from what they would normally do or be, because it just may be that they're living in this world at that moment, and they're so fatigued that they flirt with something they would normally never do. Does that make sense? David had that issue. Next week, we're going to show it from the life of Elijah, which is even more plain. Even more, you see it in the life of Elijah. And then the third week, 2 weeks from today, we're going to explain how you refill these tanks. Every single one of them, but especially the emotional tank. And if everybody can understand it, all across Cordell, all across the state, all across the nation, all across the world, if everybody can understand it, our marriages and our families and our churches, our everything would be healthier. Everything.